Jaga, doing Jagad. And we were supposed to have Emma Reese, but she can't come because for sort of family reasons. So I'm going to start by just asking Amit and Paolo to talk about their sort of their books and their sort of research that's informed them a little bit, and then we can have some. I'll ask Alex to talk about some of his work and trying to make some relevant connections, and then we'll have some general discussion. And there's a few seats here at the front. If anybody's like crowded in things at the back who wants to sit in the front, there are seats. Okay, so I think I'm going to start with Amit, asking Amit to talk a bit about this really fascinating book. So, Jagata. Well, I'm about to start introducing the book, but you can do that. Okay.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay. Wow. I'm going to get feedback. That's fine.
There's no feedback. Why don't you just...
Should I sit? Okay. So my book is called Jugaar Time. So the word Jugaar, and I think everyone should say it with me. It's Jugaar with like the pirates R. So everyone say Jugaar, Jugaar. There you go. So there it is. That's it's a Hindi Punjabi word that means literally to work around something, anything. So I've linked it to what I would call everyday hacking in India. So the book is based on anthropological work I conducted in, and I do an anthropology of what I call affect. So it's an anthropology into people's capacities to affect and be affected. So I did anthropological work in Delhi, Bombay, and Bhopal, and a little bit in Bangalore. And it was the book is based on that research. I kind of want to start. I am going to start with this provocation, I think, and that is that the possible and the potential are different, and it's important, I think, to politically make that distinction. The possible is already included in what we understand as the real or the actual. And so some people on the left think about real possible worlds. Another world is possible. You hear that phrase a lot. But for me, the reason why it was important to look at Jugaar as a practice was that it taps into the potentiality of the body in its ecological context. So a capacity is not just something that's possible. It touches on what is purely potential. What is possible is already included, as I said, in the real. The potential is something that is not already given. And that to me is very important. And for me, potentiality is where a monstrous future meets a very administered present. So my method, as I was saying in my book, is what I would call a kind of an open synthesis. I'm not a strict Hegelian in that sense. I believe it important to keep the dialectic open and sort of look at how bodies are changed in what I call techno-perceptual assemblages. So how your mobile phone, you and your mobile phone, is a techno-perceptual assemblage, right? It's an intimate device. It's a device that you feel connected to in a variety of ways, and of course it's generating information about you in an ecology of data and so on and so forth. The other sort of method that I work with and try to develop in the book is what I would call a diagrammatics. I try to diagram the mobile phone, different technologies, but Jugaar itself as an ecology of force, of senses, and of values. Here's the book, except it's longer. And I really like the cover, I didn't do it. A friend of mine painted this cover. Friends of mine painted this cover, and it kind of, I think, highlights both a kind of ecological disaster that's happening across India, and it also highlights the way in which people are in many ways unconscious around it and sort of not paying attention. So in the book, I look at jugaad as a practice that has been a practice of generally poor people, people who are thought of as lower caste in India, and of course caste is a very, very important vector of power in India. And it's become, of course, jugaad has also become a celebrated pedagogy in business and management discourse. So I teach in a business school. I teach this stuff in a business school. And in business and management discourse, they have taken up jugaad. And in fact, there are books now being published with the title jugaad in them. And how do they talk about it? They talk about it as frugal innovation. Right? This is how poor people innovate. And this is what we can learn from poor people. This is kind of how business and management has taken up the term jugaad. And for me, of course, I thought that was, it's kind of just a euphemism for stealing value, for capturing the value that is produced by people in conditions of abject poverty and discrimination. So that was, for me, a very important distinction, again, to make in the book, that jugaad is an everyday practice, but it's being taken up in ways that really try to capture the value of it. Another aspect of the book, and I'm sort of jumping around everywhere, so bear with me, but is ethics. Is there an ethics to jugaad? And this term ethics is important to me, not from the perspective of Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader kind of ethics, right? Not from the perspective of morality, but from the perspective of embodiment. And I've learned a lot from different traditions of ethical thought, and certainly feminist ethical considerations of embodiment, and a Spinozist, sort of Baruch Spinoza's tradition of ethics as, again, this way of understanding how bodies co-evolve with the technologies that they're in ecologies with. And for me, going back to what I was saying about the possible and the potential, this ethics of embodiment is about the potential of our individual and collective capacities to hack into entrenched power and structures of exploitation. And this is, for me, where the political importance of jugaad comes from. It's an ethics of what Adorno called the fourth estate, the lumpen proletariat. Some of the examples that I look at in the book are mobile phone ecologies. So I did interviews with sort of mobile phone repair wallas, is what they're called in India. Just sort of corner repair stalls, people without, of course, kind of hacking into the phone, breaking any warranty that you might or might not have, and doing what they can with it to get your screen working again, to get that virus off the phone, and so on and so forth. I also did an ethnography of what is called in India mobile value-added services, which is huge in India. And a value-added service is like a banking message you get about from your bank, right? So if you take out money from an ATM, you get a message from something like that. Jokes, astrology, and so on and so forth. And that sort of, as many of you probably know, the mobile phone ecology in India is massive, and it's growing at an exponential rate, and it has for the past 12 years. There's something like 1.4 billion handsets in India, and many people have two, and so on and so forth, and they're constantly changing every 6 months their mobile phones. So the phone itself has become a certain vector of transformation. Many people are sort of touting it as a device for development, and in some ways it has been that, but it has also been a technology of misogyny. So there's, throughout India, there's many cases now, and monthly, of the phone being used as a way of coercing women into sex, or basically harassing women. So men have been using the phone in that kind of weaponized way. So for me, that's also another important aspect of the book, what I try to pursue in the book, and that is a gendered critique of jugaar as a practice. Jugaar is generally thought of as a really kind of heroic, masculinist thing that people who have power can sort of just get around things, and because they're sort of individual or geniuses and things like that. And while the people who introduced me to jugaar were all women, the dominant discourse of it is by and large a masculinist one. The other, I think, important aspect of jugaar as a workaround is precisely the problem of work. What does work mean in a society structured in the specific dominance of the caste hierarchy and the class articulations of a country that's quickly neoliberalizing, as India is? And it's, I think, indicative that jugaar has become such a important discourse in India precisely because work is a problem and everyone's looking for ways of getting around work. And I think for me it's an important historical conjuncture to be able to understand how neoliberalism is transforming everyday life in India. And in that way, I suggest in the book, I argue in the book, that jugaar is implicitly a critique of capitalist exploitation. That having been said, jugaar doesn't have a given politics to it. There's no party for jugaar. There's no sort of obvious connection between jugaar as working around anything and a particular political ideology. Another sort of important aspect of jugaar for me was what the autonomists call commoning. How jugaar as practice becomes a part of commoning a certain language, a certain knowledge, a know-how around working around power, working around entrenched power. So I try in the book to engage with different sort of strands of autonomous Marxism, post-colonial Marxism, and for me one of the most important aspects of that in contemporary criticism is, of course, these different places where commoning happens in everyday life. So, in that sense, jugaar, to sort of think with Mario Tronti, is a way in which people practice everyday life within and against capitalism, within and against Brahmanical Hinduism. Okay, so the sort of last thing I'm going to say is that I'm working on attention now. I'm working on the attention economy. I teach courses in creative industries and am particularly interested in how attention is molded, modulated to produce value. And of course also to change the body, to change our capacities to attend. For me, jugaar is a mode of joyous attention. To be able to participate in a practice that says that what has been bequeathed us by history is not what is necessarily what our future has to be. And that to me is a way of understanding the world in a kind of joyous mode of transformation. So that to me is also part of its ethics. Which links immediately back to the question of habit. Jugaar breaks with habits. It's something that's constantly questioning how we're habituated to our own exploitation, our own domination. And so that's also been a very important focus. That is a very important focus of the book. So I'm going to leave it right there. Cheers.
Well, that's great. Thanks. I mean, that's really fascinating. And I thought I'd just like, draw out a little bit for people these final comments about kind of joyousness, a mode of jugar as a mode of joyous attention, and because I think that states, I think for you as for me, the idea of the joyous has a very specific resonance, and and it's relevant. It's particularly relevant today because the second episode of the podcast, of which I'm one of the collective making it, the ACFM podcast, just got released today, and that's about the concept of collective joy. And I think this, so you can get a full attention, you get a full explanation of collective joy there. But joy obviously has this particular resonance in the Spinozan tradition. They're coming from Spinoza. That joyousness doesn't just mean happiness. It means a situation in which, on the one hand, the capacities of the subject or the body or the collective are all enhanced in some way. Just like this, we've got some seats down the front if anybody wants any. If anybody's kind of straining to see from the back. And this joyousness, this enhancement of the capacities of the body to act, the subject to act, the collective to act, is always dependent on a kind of enhanced mode of relation. That you can, it's because the capacity of that body or that subject or that person or that kind of assemblage of a person on a phone has somehow enhanced their capacities, enhanced their capacity to act in the world by relating to others. So it's always, it's always based on a radically non-individualistic conception of both what it means to be in the world and of agency and also of pleasure. That pleasure is always to some extent actually a kind of enhancement of the capacities. I mean, this is a kind of theme. I always, I'm kind of drawing this out here, but it's a theme of the series over the past few years. It's something we've come back to a few times. That I think there is, and it's, what you would distinguish this from is a sort of, within the intellectual tradition you're coming from anyway. That's how I understand it. We distinguish this from a conception of selfhood and a conception of agency and a conception of pleasure, which would be sort of bourgeois, which would be capitalistic, but also one which would be psychoanalytic to some extent, in that that would tend to assume that whenever you engage in relationships with others, whenever you try and do anything or make anything or get anything, you're always trying to fill that gap which is already in you. You're trying to overcome the lack, as it's said. You're trying to find something. And it's a very different approach. The Spinozist approach says, no, it's not. That's not true. It's not the case that every time we feel good, it's because we felt bad, and now something has made us feel slightly less bad. It's because actually by constituting productive relationships with other people, with other bodies, with machines, etc., we make something happen in the world that wasn't happening before, and that's what it means to feel good. That's the nature of it. I think that's very important, sort of philosophically, because I think in some sense you can't really have a socialist politics actually without that sort of conception. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Just so everybody's clear about that. All right. Well, I think before we go any further, I'm going to be on to ask Paolo to talk about his book and some of his research, and then we'll bring in Alex and we'll open it up after that. Is that okay? All right.
Should we try?
I don't know. Let's see if you can stretch it. Yeah. Let me try. I think we should.
Okay, let's switch. All right, can you hear me? Mm-hmm. Hi everybody, thanks very much for inviting me. My book is on the question of organization, ultimately, that I think is a question that is very timely at the moment, in the present wave of left resurgence, in the present wave of millennial socialism, as it has been sometimes described. at a time when a series of coordinates and axioms that we thought were in a way impregnable to change are now very open to change in certain respects. And the question of organization is ultimately the question of how do we come together and how do we act together in a way that is structured, coordinated, and ultimately efficient. And the question of organization has been the question of the political party, right, for a very long time in Western politics, at least for the last 200 years. And this question is relevant because the question of the political party is coming back because parties, in a way, are coming back. I mean, if you have read some political science of the last 20, 30 years, a common thread, their leitmotif was the idea that the political party was fading away, that political parties were becoming less and less important. They were losing their centrality in the political system. And that had to do with a number of phenomena, starting from the very serious decline in the membership of political parties. And in that, the UK is a very good example of that. If you look at the Conservative Party, for example, that now has, I think, less than 120,000 members, it's a very small political party and declining because most of its members are about 65-year-old. In the 50s, it had 3 million members. 3 million members. It was a huge party. And it was also a social force, very rooted in communities, the conservative associations. It was the place to go if you wanted to find a wife or a husband before Tinder was available. And same with the Labour Party, right? I mean, now we are celebrating the fact that the Labour Party has 600,000 members almost. I mean, it's kind of going that direction after the years of, at the end of Tony Blair leadership, when it had 150,000 members. But let's not forget that back in the 50s, it had almost 2 million members. Right? These were really kind of mass parties in the proper sense of the term. What is interesting is that now, after the crisis of 2008, we are seeing signs that parties are coming back, both old parties, as Labour revitalizing, but also new parties emerging in other countries, which are the parties I describe in the book as digital parties. When I use the term digital parties, I'm referring to parties such as the Five Star Movement in Italy, now in government, self-described as an internet party, or the party of the people of the web, Web 1.0 probably more than Web 2.0, I'll explain later why. Podemos in Spain, also very vocal about the fact that he wants to use digital technology for organization and democracy. Parties such as France Insoumise in France. I don't know if you've seen the very funny picture of Mélenchon wearing a virtual reality helmet. But it's a party that may seem more oldie and traditional, but it has also pursued a digital democracy agenda. It has created its own platform for decision making and such things. And before that, the pirate parties in Scandinavian countries mostly, right, that have been in a way seen as the first sign of this transformation of political parties, with the Swedish Pirate Party, the first of the kind, founded on the 1st of January 2006. Now, why are these parties digital parties? I mean, in a way, the term doesn't seem to make sense because politics and parties is digital anyway these days. It's digital by default. There's no serious candidate these days that can compete in an election without having the usual panoply of Instagram, Facebook, you name it, Snapchat, if only children could vote, accounts in order to reach out to the electorate. Yet what is specific of these parties is the way in which they use digital technology not just as a means of external communication, but also as a means to transform internal organization of political parties. There is all the number of mechanisms, structures, procedures by means of which parties make decisions ultimately and connect the leadership with the membership. This is that aspect of political parties that Antonio Gramsci described as the third element. He said that parties had 3 elements. One was the leadership, the generals, to use a military analogy, which he uses in the prison notebooks. And interestingly, he said that leadership comes first. I mean, contrary to kind of popular imagination. First, you need the leadership. Secondly, a mass element, that is the base of the party, the membership, the people who are contributing to the party in various ways, both financially and in terms of labor, volunteer activity they offer. And then you need something in the middle, right? This something in the middle, this third element, was usually composed of a number of structures, committees, party branches, and events such as party conferences, and still is for many parties, such as the Labour Party, right, that are still in the line of development of the so-called mass party of the social democratic era. Instead, with these new digital parties, this structure is for the most substituted by a platform that is similar to social media platforms, yet it has a different purpose and it has a different nature. These are the so-called participatory platforms or participation portals that have become a sort of signature feature of all these new digital parties. So if you go to Podemos website or the Five Star Movement website, you will find very prominent on the menu a section. In the case of the Five Star Movement, it's called Rousseau, after Jean-Jacques Rousseau, because they see in Rousseau a sort of ideal of their democracy. In the case of Podemos, it's called Participate. And you can sign up for this platform, which makes you a member of the party, much in the same way in which you would sign up for Facebook. Right? You have your name, your surname, your email. You don't have to pay any dues, and that is a huge difference vis-a-vis traditional parties. It really changes what it means to be a member, right? And once you do that, you can participate in a number of activities that are not that different ultimately from what we do on social media. I mean, participating in discussion about policy or about current events. For example, Podemos had a discussion section that was initially hosted on Reddit, right? And the New Yorker, in an article called Podemos, the Reddit Party, right? And they were using the upvoting, downvoting functionality in order to determine which threads basically were popular and would be moved to the portal homepage in order to then go into a more structured discussion. Then you have e-voting, right? People can vote online for the leader or the various leadership teams that go with the leader. And then there's a number of internal referendums. For example, Podemos has recently run a referendum on the recall of Pablo Iglesias and Irene Montero after there was a small scandal surrounding the way in which they purchased a home that was considered a luxury home. And that was seen by some critics as going against the rhetoric of anti-corruption, anti-elitism, and anti-luxury of the party. Pablo Iglesias and Irene Montero ultimately won by quite a wide margin. The Five Star Movement has used many referendums to expel party representatives accused of not having abided by party rules, be it sort of Jesus versus Barabbas referendum, in which invariably party members voted for the guillotine to drop on these party reps' heads. So there are all a number of applications. Some of them may look trivial, and some of them, for example, e-balloting, right? But even the most trivial one, the least innovative ones, actually have huge consequences for the way parties operate. Think about, for example, Labour, the way in which does it introduce e-balloting for the leadership election, and the consequences it had in terms of helping to increase the number of voters. Think about the fact that in this country, unions cannot use e-ballots, right? And that is for a political reason, because, for example, the UCU, my union, the lecturers' union, had recently a consultation where only 42% of people participated in the consultation, and you need to reach a quorum in this country to call a legal strike. And it is very likely that if e-balloting had been available, people would have reached the required quorum. So in the book, I explain how these new parties operate, how these different mechanisms function in quite some detail. I also explain the ideology that inspired this practice, right? Which I describe as participationism. So participationism as an ideology in which participation is not just the means to an end. as participation was usually conceived of. I mean, sometimes in sort of modernist politics, participation was almost conceived of as a sacrifice, right? Something you do for the cause as an expense of money. That's why you pay your dues, right? You are basically depriving yourself of resources you could spend in beers or in pizza for the party cause, but also in terms of political labor, right? I mean, now people say, I don't go to meetings because it's boring. I mean, it was always boring, right? It's not that before it was particularly funny, or canvassing was always something that, yes, I mean, you can find some good aspects in canvassing, but it's not really what normal people would do for entertainment, right? So it was conceived in that way. Instead, in these parties, it is as if there is a sort of utopia of participation. It's as if the kind of society people imagine is one where we will finally all be able to participate directly in a disintermediated way. To use a quote from Roberto Fico, president of the lower house, who I interviewed for the book, and a politician of the Five-Star Movement, of the more kind of left-wing side of the Five-Star Movement. Basically, he literally said and put it to me this way. I mean, it is like, Ryanair, purchasing flights on Ryanair website, or renting a house on Airbnb. Politics needs to go in that direction. You need to bypass the intermediaries and be able to decide directly, potentially, on anything affecting you. Right? So now this may sound to some people as a rosy prospect, as a utopia, as a real utopia, but in the book, as I demonstrate, there are many dark aspects to this utopia and to its application, especially, that make it look quite like a dystopia more than a utopia. In fact, partly it is true that these parties empower their members more than traditional party members. Party members are now able to decide directly on things that before they were not able to decide on. They can elect directly their leadership. They can provide some open text contribution to the development of party policy. There is a crowdsourcing of policy going on. They can participate in referendums on key issues, sort of dilemma issues that affect the party and its life. And this leads to a certain demolition of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is seen by these parties as the big enemy, and indeed these parties do away with much of the bureaucracy of traditional parties. I mean, one chapter in the book is called The Death of the Cadre, because the cadre, this kind of intermediary linking element, is the first victim of these pars destruens of these parties. Yet at the same time there is a paradox, that is the bureaucracy that Robert Michels, the famous author, the famous theorist of the political party, saw as responsible for the iron law of oligarchy, as the element that basically militated against democracy. It is disposed of, but at the same time it is substituted by something that perhaps is even more problematic. We go from an iron law of oligarchy to a silicon law of benevolent dictatorship. Now, the term benevolent dictator is being used in various digital cultures, for example, open software cultures, to describe the role played by certain arbitrators, by founders' guarantors, such as Jimmy Wales in the case of Wikipedia, or Linus Torvalds in the case of Linux, right? So these are people who basically guarantee the maintenance of the initial principles of their movement, their project, their organization, especially when it comes to disputes that are basically endangering the very survival of these organizations. And I see similarity there with the charismatic leaders or hyper leaders, as it is coming in the book, of digital parties. So these parties are characterized by this paradox that on the one hand you have this super base, this empowered membership, but this doesn't translate into a leaderless anarchist utopia a la Occupy Wall Street, or as Occupy Wall Street pretended to be, and it was not, as far as I'm concerned. In fact, this empowered membership goes hand in hand with a centralized leadership, right? Where the hyper leader and his or her own immediate entourage is the entity that really calls the shot. There is a sort of alliance between the very bottom of the party and the very top of the party. And to conclude, this leads to some quite problematic consequences for democracy. That is, on the team, we are promised a deliberative democracy, where we can have a qualitative input on decisions, where we can really be heard and express ourselves, we can participate instead of delegating, as Casaleggio, the guru of the First Movement, puts it. In reality, we are delivered more of a reactive democracy that eerily resembles our social media interactions, where for the most, the type of contribution we give is liking or not liking, right? Because of the hierarchy and asymmetry of social media environments, where we would all like to be Rihanna's and Justin Bieber's and your favorite influencers, but unfortunately we don't happen to be, right? So this is quite disappointing state of affairs, but at the same time I think that this model of political party is one that we will have to deal with, as it has become not just a matter of rather small parties, because some of these parties are now in government as the First Movement, but also because other mainstream parties, including Labour in Britain, the Socialist Party in Spain, and the SPD in Germany, are progressively including and adopting some of these features. So I think, in a way, the digital party is both the crux and daylight of digital democracy, and it will continue to be a very key front of conflict and development in coming years.
Well, thanks, Paolo. That's fantastic. So we're obviously looking at, I think what's like, the issue that's at stake in both of the presentations, actually, in both your books. That's why this brought you together, is the question of, well, in what ways does agency, collective agency, become possible? Like in the era of these sort of platform technologies, kind of hyper digitization, and I think you've done the book does a really important job of drawing out, in particular, some of the limitations. I think that's the ways in which there's a certain kind of logic. One of the things it seems to me is that my theorisation of this, which I'm just sort of working on at the moment, I've talked about it a little bit here in the past and sort of casually, but not really worked it up, is that is in terms of the idea that there is. I've always been very influenced by the kind of the regulation school, the kind of school of kind of Gramscian economists, which argue that capitalism tends to move through these phases, which usually last a few decades, which are really defined by what they call the specific regime of accumulation. And the regime of accumulation is characterised by a specific mode of regulation, and both of those terms refer to the fact that, well, the generic features of capitalism, wage labour, commodification, capital accumulation, can be organised in lots of different ways, depending on the technologies available, the systems available, the cultural habits. And they're usually because of technological shifts. The way in which capital accumulation is actually organised will shift from one period to another, and that has huge knock-on effects. There are these kind of inherent logics. So the shift towards post-Fordism, the shift towards just-in-time production, the shift towards the effects of a certain wave of automation, of a certain wave of globalisation, etc. In the 70s and 80s, really is the conditions for a whole set of cultural and social changes, including, for example, the decline of the party. So the kind of the analysis of the analysis that was made by some people on the British left in the 80s was direct, that the political, which I think was correct, the mass party was declining as mass industrial production capitalism kind of declined, and then now I think we're in a new phase. We're in the phase which Nick Cernacek, who'll be speaking here in a few weeks, has named platform capitalism, which Robin Murray, in an interview that Andy Coffey and I did with him a few years ago, also didn't exactly use the phrase platform capitalism, but it was said we were in the age of platforms rather than the age of post-Fordism. It's closely related to what Zuboff has called surveillance capitalism. I think I'm waiting for the onslaught of critiques of Zuboff, which we're all going to be engaged in for the next 10 years. But for now, their book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, is very ambitious, to attempt to kind of synthesise these things. So it's a new kind of phase, and I think I mean, it seems to me what you've really drawn out in it, which in a way which I find really useful, is the way in which these in a certain set of social logics get reproduced within the kind of platform economy, and that the parties, the kind of the digital parties in particular that you're identifying, they really do seem to me to be. I mean, really, they seem to be a really good exemplification of the way in which. And to me, an illustration of the argument, actually, that there is something in this analysis that says there are these very persistent kind of social logics, which they're not determined, but they're very much encouraged by a particular, really whole kind of techno-social paradigm that we're now in. So I thought that, that observation is really powerful to me. That despite the promise, everybody wants everybody wants these technologies to be delivering mass deliberative democracy. But they're not. They're delivering something more like a political party that looks like a Facebook group, and they're good at doing the things that Facebook groups are good at doing. Actually, there are some things which Facebook groups aren't really good at doing. There's some things they're really good for. And I always say, and I've said here loads of times, you can't write off the fact that it was the leftist Facebook groups that suddenly made everybody realise that Jeremy Corbyn becoming leader of the Labour Party was a political possibility. So and they were good for that. That's a good thing. They were good. But they're not good. They're not good at really at generating. They're not good at decision making, collective decision making. Seems to me that's what your findings have done. Actually, they're not. They're good. They're quite good at endless deliberation if that's what you want. But you can have a really great discussion, like on a Facebook thread, with the right people. But it's not going to decide what it's not. And the problem it seems to me that gets posed in your book is the question of and it's the fact that lots of people, including myself, including you in other work, have said that ultimately democracy is about collective decision making. It's not just about participation. It's not just about deliberation. And it seems to me that's really something that's been brought out by your kind of analysis. That we have a real kind of problem, especially when moving from the kind of molecular level. I think Amit is describing to the molar level that the party operates at. Well, how do we use these things for actual decision making? Is that right? You think is that? Yeah.
Yes. Well, we want a more qualified response. No, completely.
Not really. You can just say how clever I am. Yes. Good. Moving on. Right. Well, I'll take it. Do you want to add anything?
No. Now mine went completely blank.
That's okay. No, that's fine. No, well, I didn't invite Amit to do anything but agree with my kind of brilliant summary. So there's no reason why you should have to. All right, but I think it seems to me these are the things that are at stake, and I think it's at stake, and it's really interesting that Amit talked about potential, because we're talking about a situation in which there's obviously a kind of democratic potential to digital technology, and the question of how and in what ways and at what levels that gets realised. I mean, it's a pity Emma's not here because I think I'm going to talk to Alex for a minute, and then I'll explain the things I was going to talk to Emma about. I mean, it's not like I didn't know what she was going to say, or I wouldn't have asked her. But we'll get. But I think the issue. I mean, it's important because it's really. I mean, the dynamic you describe is really a precise description of what's going on in the Labour Party right now. That we don't. It's not really clear that with the Labour Party. What is it? We get to choose. We know the members get to choose the leader now. We get to go canvassing when there's an election. It's not clear to me if we get to do anything else, or if anyone gets to do anything else apart from half a dozen people in the leader's office. It's really unclear, and I think you've really explained that that's part of a very general tendency actually in the kind of digital party. But I want to move on. I want to ask Alex about some of your kind of, because you've been involved. I know that you've been involved at different times in kind of politically motivated coding, etc. Hacking. I always think at this point we should make clear about this term hacking, because a lot of people who will already know this, some people won't. That hacking, that people think, a lot of people still think hacking means like breaking security systems with modems. But I mean, classically, hacking really just means coding. I mean, it doesn't really mean, it means kind of coding, kind of playing around with code, doesn't it? The original terminology. But I thought maybe you could tell us about some of the specific projects you've been engaged in recently. I was thinking about Newspeak House and also Common Knowledge, and like what's going on there, and what the kind of work you're doing there is like.
Cool. Thank you very much. Yeah, so I'll kind of like start off by saying I'm a software engineer. That's my kind of profession. But I began that profession being a teenage hacker. My dad discovered a bunch of like hacking texts in my bedroom and took me to one side and said, "Alex, no knowledge is evil, but make sure you don't get nicked." So I've been kind of like involved in computers since I was very young, like since I was like 4 or 5 years old. And throughout my teenage years, I was like a teenage hacker. My hacker handle was called Havoc, and I spent many hours on my computer, like logging into foreign telnet servers and running shell accounts and blah blah blah, the kind of things that every teenage boy should get up to. And so that's kind of like, so I don't have formal like training in like software engineering. I have kind of like fallen into it. So in my day job, I'm a software engineer. I kind of like help teams kind of produce software to high quality, and also code myself, primarily in JavaScript and also Python, PHP, and a bunch of other languages, mainly on the web. So the kind of one of the big projects, as Joe mentions, that I'm kind of involved with is a cooperative called Common Knowledge. We kind of founded about a year ago, around this time actually. And the kind of purpose of Common Knowledge is a digital cooperative that kind of like builds digital platforms, digital tools for specifically what we call direct as opposed to representational politics. So the kind of work we do is to try and develop tools for kind of more what we might call activist modes of political activity, rather than kind of like what we might call kind of like electoral modes of political participation. So although we would not deny that like electoral modes of political participation are really important, we would say that they are kind of well served and perhaps well understood, the technologies around them. In terms of, for example, tools like Nation Builder, tools like Action Network, there are tools available for doing this kind of thing. But our kind of gambit is that the people have made various attempts to kind of produce platforms that kind of like allow people to raise their capacity and like understand how they would be able to kind of act in their communities in the past, but no one has really kind of bottomed this out. So as I said, we're kind of like, one of our primary activities is research. So I don't know how many people here are familiar with the kind of way that kind of software products, like all the software products on your phone, will be kind of like developed for this methodology. But I'm not talking about the technical methodology by which they're developed, so not the code or the the kind of like digital infrastructure, but the majority of them are actually developed through a kind of feedback cycle of kind of like quasi-ethnographic research, followed by producing software itself, followed by measuring that through quantitative metrics. It's called a build, measure, learn cycle. And that's how most software is developed. And there's controversy with Facebook and other platforms about how they show like certain things to certain users and certain things to other users, and that's de rigueur in the software industry. So one of the things we kind of do is we kind of go out into the field and do ethnographic research. And we've actually done a whole bunch of ethnographic research in Hackney itself. One of the kind of things that we want to do is kind of like understand in a very limited geography how to kind of do the techniques that we want to do, the kind of like interventions we want to make that allow people to kind of get involved in activism in their local area. But then we want to be able to roll that out. But in order to understand that properly, we're going to begin in a small place and we're going to kind of like roll it out to other geographies. So the first thing we did in October, and this is where the kind of like interesting like kind of work in relation to the two other speakers comes in, is we interviewed 30 people around Hackney who are activists of various kinds about their kind of like, we asked them 2 questions. Or it was an hour-long interview, and we kind of like had two elements. The first thing we were interested in was kind of like how they came to consider themselves an activist or become an activist. Because we're interested in kind of getting people out of their moments of like passivity, the yelling at the TV moment, into a moment of activity. So the first kind of like thing is we asked their kind of like political background, like how they come to it. A lot of people came to it through families. That was quite an interesting observation that we didn't think we'd find. a lot of people came into through crisis moments or moments of kind of epiphany or realization. Particularly people involved in the climate change movement. We spoke to Extinction Rebellion activists, and they spoke about reading a book and realizing, holy shit, we're actually fucked. I better do something about this. Okay. So that was the first half of the interview, because we're interested in understanding the kind of like psychodynamics of like how people become activists and how we might like kind of engineer these parameters within a digital context formally. The second half of the interview was kind of like a bit more boring, but probably more interesting for our purposes, which was talking about the specific technologies they used. And the vast majority of these technologies were not bespoke technologies. Part of the, all these technologies they used were kind of workarounds for existing consumer technology. So the most commonly used, certainly in Hackney, and I believe in the country, political technology on the left in the UK is WhatsApp. Put your hand up if you're in a political WhatsApp group. Yeah. For the tape, that's most people. So people use WhatsApp a lot, but it's quite interesting how people kind of like have met the limitations of WhatsApp as a means of discussion, particularly with large groups. It's very difficult to make decisions, it's very difficult to catch up, you don't really know who's in the conversation, who you're talking to, and so on and so forth. That was like a major observation. We also talked, people also talked about if they felt they were organisers, like specifically they saw their role as an organiser, kind of like what technology they'd been involved with, and the kind of like, it tends to be kind of like the standard like online cloud-based stuff like Google Apps. That is like a big part of like all these people's practice. Sometimes people use Slack, which is another form of like office conversation software, in order to do this. So we obviously asked them to like observe the limitations of these softwares and like kind of talk them through. For example, Extinction Rebellion uses to organise a piece of software called Basecamp. And Basecamp is a piece of software that's designed for small to medium-sized digital agencies to kind of organise their work. They use it en masse to organise thousands and thousands of activists. Okay, so we did this ethnographic research, and what we kind of do is we kind of try and find the kind of gaps in this. And this is, as I say, the technique that most products you have on your phone, kind of like they have kind of done themselves. They do this kind of period of ethnographic research. They kind of find the pain points and the difficulties, and then they develop out their own kind of software to kind of fulfill those needs, what are called user needs. So we kind of like began by doing that because we had a hypothesis that that people would do more if they were only able, because we had the idea that the existing political organisations, the kind of thing, these digital parties, in most time, people were kind of like not doing anything. They were kind of fallow. In between electoral cycles, if they were in like a political party, they kind of like had nothing to do. But they would do more. They would do more in their community, for example, if they were able. So our hypothesis was all major political parties don't do a good job of this, and basically through our ethnographic research, this was more or less confirmed. Also, our kind of thing was like other civil society actors don't do a good job of this, particularly in digital space, unions and so on. Again, that came up. People were like, why can't I change where my branch is in a web form? Why can't I do that? Blah, blah, blah. And my hypothesis is, like kind of like speculative hypothesis, is that one of the problems with digital, the agency you have as a digital actor on your phone is it's so incredibly powerful, like what you're able to do with your phone. Now, Uber's a terrible company, and we can all talk about their workers' rights, but the sheer ability, the phenomenology of pressing a button on your phone, having a car turn up to pick you up and take you wherever you want to go within reason, like, is quite incredible. That kind of like frictionless, and we all know that isn't quite frictionless, particularly in the case of Uber, but that kind of digital experience confronts the traditional party form in a very aggressive way. Okay. So anyway, so we found our hypothesis was that people weren't well served, and we discovered this in fact was the case. The kind of organisations that were kind of more ad hoc, for example, people who were more anarchic and kind of like did outreach work for homeless people, for example, they use digital technology too, but in a disorganised way, but also they use the same techniques as the other actors. And also like people in the environmental movement, same techniques. Extinction Rebellion, pretty much the same deal. Other environmental groups, NGOs, for example, Friends of the Earth, did kind of like this kind of like motion action. So we kind of like, that was kind of the first step, was kind of this ethnographic research, and then we tried to like try and find the points where people were finding problems and what we're trying to do is develop like an application that in time will kind of allow people to basically build their own capacity to advocate for themselves and advocate their communities in whatever space they're in. Well, so if you think about digital apps, this is more kind of like Headspace than Tinder. The kind of initial mental model for this was like Tinder, you know, you'll match like local activist groups. But we felt what people need more, particularly people who want to do something but aren't able or don't feel they know who, is more of a kind of like a training app kind of thing. Okay. So that's kind of where we're at, and we're kind of like developing this out. We've kind of like done almost a month's worth of work on this, kind of like slowly taking steps, kind of like letting people know that they're kind of like part of an experimental service, and then kind of like taking them through different pathways to you know, find things they wouldn't have seen before. And one of our kind of working things is that digital platforms as they exist right now make even the work of discovery of like things to do politically in your local area actually quite difficult. Okay, so we kind of like explored this. We tried to like find people in different cities, political stuff they could do, but we found out that what we had to do instead was like a bunch of upfront work. So we directly contacted organisers and we said like, hey, we're going to do this thing. We want to onboard people into activist groups through WhatsApp. Are you up for doing it? A lot of organisers said yes. And yeah, so we kind of like developed out this service working with organisers from the likes of Greenpeace, the local Labour Party, who else did we work with? London Renters Union, they had a really good one, some local like anti-racist, anti-fascist groups, blah, blah, blah. And as I say, we're trying to like develop out this service that kind of solves for those problems of participation that people were observing in their organisational context, in their kind of political context on one hand, and on the other hand, their kind of digital context, the existing tools they were using. Okay, yeah, and so that's kind of where we're at, and ultimately, our kind of like political goal is to kind of like solve some of like the widespread problems with political organising in this country, as we kind of observed them and as we kind of found through our ethnography. Because in order to do things at scale in today's society, particularly in an automated and reproducible fashion, digital technology is definitively incredibly useful, as we all know. So, you know, some of the problems of politics, like organisational politics, are, you know, inactivity. There's been a lot of talk of things of like Corbynism from below, and there's been a lot of chat on notions of, you know, a social reproductive politics. But how many genuine, for example, food banks have been founded by leftist groups? Very few. There are a few, but very few. You know, no one has cashed these things out in a sustainable manner in the UK context. But as I said, and as our kind of research has found thus far, is like people are up for doing a little bit more. And there's, you know, other capacity issues. Sheer boots on the ground. You know, sheer boots on the ground to come run your homelessness kitchen. Accessibility. You know, you have to be in the right WhatsApp groups to even, know what's going on. Okay. And a big thing as well is repeated work. Lack of institutional memory, particularly when it comes to digital technology. This is something that we're kind of like trying to address, not so much through our direct work on our kind of like, you know, products, apps and that stuff, but through like literally our coordination of making sure other groups, broadly speaking in progressive leftist politics, know that other groups are doing roughly the same thing. So for example, almost every political campaign will at the start of their campaign write a tool to send people SMS messages. There's like 10 of these things, and like the UK Labour Party developed its own, Momentum developed its own, and then borrowed one off the shelf from Bernie Sanders' campaign. Everyone develops their own, and it's basically repeated work, and it's not a lack of like shared understanding, a lack of institutional knowledge that someone has already built these things. People have already learned the lessons and limitations of this technology. And what actually often happens in these kind of things is they kind of like start very fast and they kind of burn out. Okay, so what we want to kind of develop is kind of like the tools, the technologies, the ecosystems to kind of like allow these things to operate on a more sustainable basis. Okay, how long more have I got? Don't tell yourself another one. So that's one of the things we're doing. So for example, there are 3, maybe 4 applications at the moment trying to provide a digital platform to organise workers in their workplace. With a variety of like kind of political nuances to kind of where they stand. There's one called Wobbly, I guess you can kind of guess from the name Wobbly where their politics are. I'll leave that for a lesson for the reader. There's one called Organize, good name, very simple. There's one in the US called Co-worker. So our thing was, can we just get all these people in a room to actually talk to each other about what they're building, and hopefully learn from each other the lessons of how to intervene digitally in a social space to organise workers. And so that's one of our kind of things we're doing. We're kind of developing our own stuff, and we're also kind of coordinating, attempting to kind of promote a common knowledge, if you will, across progressive groups about what other people have done in the past, what worked and what didn't work, what worked incredibly successfully, and then to try and encode this in code. And this already happens to some extent on the left. For example, earlier you spoke about Podemos' platform. Now, Podemos' platform was ultimately a piece of open source software built in Ruby, it's the programming language, built on a kind of Ruby stack called Ruby on Rails. And this was then forked, and in software you have this notion of a fork, which is basically you take a piece of existing software and you kind of take the source code and then you take it off in another direction. So if you ever use the kind of track changes kind of aspect of Word or Microsoft Office or so, that's the kind of thing you're doing. You kind of make a copy of it and you take it off in another direction. Okay? So a fork of that was used by the Madrid Council to kind of do their kind of public public consultation activity, voting on stuff and so on and so forth. And then later it was actually used for Momentum's digital democracy platform in early 2017, which was called MXV. So MXV was the exact same software as was used by Podemos with additions and further development. So as I said, one of the kind of things we do is trying to make people aware of what's going on in this digital space. And of course, these two speakers are kind of speaking to that directly, because before I kind of came across Amit's book, I was woefully ignorant of these kind of practices as they're practiced in India and the rest of the world. Although at the moment, our ambitions don't stretch much beyond Hackney and our ability to organise people there. So I guess that's it about our work. It is kind of ongoing. And I think just a couple of quick reflections. There's kind of this thing, if people have read the Rules for Revolutionaries book, which is written by some Bernie Sanders organisers, one of the big things they say in there is don't build your own technology. Don't bother. Just use off-the-shelf technology, because it's incredibly powerful. And at Common Knowledge, we entirely agree with that. And in fact, our platform together right now is just cobbled together out of consumer technology, even though there were there's two software engineers on the team who could ably build something, because we don't yet know exactly what we need to build. So we're kind of throwing stuff together into a service to kind of understand what we need to build. But I feel that as kind of time goes on, progressive and political movements on the left need to understand how to build political technology. Because as I said, some political parties have already begun to build this, but it's quite limited. And there's a few extant examples. Who in the room has used Lumio? Few people. Okay, so Lumio is a decision-making tool for small to medium-sized and large groups, although it doesn't work especially well for large groups. And it kind of came out of the Occupy Wall Street movement. So what I'm kind of saying is, you can get quite far by using consumer technology, but at the end of the day, consumer technology, you are kind of hacking it. You're using it for another purpose that it wasn't originally designed for. So what we're trying to do, and what a few groups in the broad progressive left space are trying to do now, is actually develop out that bespoke technology to fulfill those specific user needs for specific things like political organising, political decision making, and so on and so forth. This is obviously a big task and a hard task, but it's my kind of hypothesis that ultimately, although Facebook groups are a really good way to make a decision, they're a really good place potentially to have a discussion, at the end of the day, Facebook don't give a shit about your leftist discussion group. In fact, they don't give a shit about your event, your nice protest, or so on and so forth. The thing they're most interested in is advertising and selling advertising clicks and your data exhaust. Those are the things, in this room, I imagine most people are aware of that, but that's quite simply the truth. And the same goes for every single platform that is essentially mining the commons in order to create its kind of own knowledge. As I say, my kind of like the kind of like gambit of common knowledge and the other work I'm working on is those technologies that kind of like have baked into them their politics, and begin by researching the kind of politics that are desired and kind of researching the current practices and then developing that out, is something that the kind of left needs to build out in the next 5 or 10 years, preferably in the next 1 year. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Alex. That's really useful. And I mean, it seems to me that what you're really directly engaged in is, or the issue that you are engaged with, is, as much as anything, the issue of scale. That the question, and this is the sort of the issue which is raised by sort of Amit's and Paolo's, books and sort of presentations being juxtaposed. That Amit is concerned with a certain kind of, certain kinds of collective agency in a very local scale, at a sort of molecular scale in a way, as Deleuze and Guattari would have put it. And as I said before, Paolo was really looking at that kind of agency at the molar scale, the scale of kind of mostly these are national organisations engaged in national infrastructures, and you're directly concerned with what comes in between them, aren't you? Just directly concerned with the question, well, how do you scale up the kinds of sort of creative agency and modes of joyous attention that Amit is talking about in a way which creates a kind of intermediary space, which I think it was quite bad. I mean, one of the things Paolo actually said, wasn't it, where there isn't exactly the kind of intermediary infrastructure that in between the kind of very local scale and the national scale, which is why you end up with hyper leaders, as in some sense just taking all the decisions. Is that right?
Yes.
Good.
I mean, definitely. Like the thing is about scale. It's like digital technology allows for incredibly like cheap jumps to high scale, particularly now. And obviously this is why people, I was reflecting on my own activist practice when I walked over here, like the night and day between like 1999 and 2005 or thereabouts, was like anyone can set up a blog, anyone can set up a website, you can set up a Gmail account, you can begin your kind of activist thing very, very easily, and like that was the kind of standard practice back in the day. It was like easy set this stuff up, but it's getting that to scale that is the kind of key question that we're kind of engaged with, and of course this is like something that digital technology, because of that reproducibility factor, like concerns itself most intimately with.
All right, thanks. Well, I think last week we experimented with having a break last time, didn't we? We had and it worked well, I thought, didn't you? Yeah. I think we're going to have a 5-minute break, literally 5 minutes, so people can order a pizza. Well, at 10 minutes people start to drift off, honestly. If it's a full 10 minutes, people who don't want drinks or pizza get annoyed. It'll be a generous 5 minutes. All right, so people can get a drink, go to the toilet, smoke a cigarette, and then we'll come back for some general discussion. I'll say a little bit about the Labour Party, given that Emma's not here, and the 2017 experience, but then we'll get into a more general discussion. Okay, thanks.
How was his home? When did he get back?
I'm gonna try like this with your go.
Could you drop me an email? Yeah, that sounds great. My society
literally just wrote an essay all about Caribbean was like, no, not about Puerto Rico, but that like feeling of like wanting to be home and then coming home and then realizing basically neocolonialism, colonialism, and all of these things. Trying to theorize your emotions.
No, I don't. I kind of like vaguely aware of them.
I finished Rome a week ago, so I haven't really been able to. But it's been weird because like no one else has finished. Well, I mean,
Yeah, everyone wants to talk about Catherine. Not even got basically all the
yeah, totally. Next Thursday. How are you, man? Yeah, it's really nice.
couldn't have gone better. I've said that before about it.
Wow, I thought it went badly. And so like non-confrontational.
Yeah, it's probably just the cycle over. I got really confused and quite stressed. No, I lost my cigarettes. I dropped my cigarettes away.
Oh shit.
But apart from that,
Your exam, wow, smashed it.
the question is about it. Look at what I wrote in the answers. I was like, oh, so.
That's so good.
But also everyone else thought it went really well as well. So like,
That's so nice. I literally vomited in my Spanish oral. I just was like, what a crazy. Are you going to stay in London? Yeah, I was scared that I didn't work on it. Okay. She was like, so bad. So funny. Orals are hilarious. Do you know I was just
you've got to take on the job.
yeah. Leaving the house or spending money. So it's 7 days old exam.
And it finishes on the 20th. Your hand in is 28. You just want to hang, hold on for 24 hours.
Anything. I'll probably just put like
Meet me at 24.
I'll probably have it in
2 and a 4.
I'll come join you anyway.
Okay, nice.
Probably not as late. And we're going to have our party. Alright, now also, let's go with this.
I know. You ever stay with comes up with that? That would be something.
So I think when we get out, we should do like yellows all together and go to a palace in London. Go to a palace in London. You know it's being held. It'd be really fun. Do a little like antique.
It's on a Friday night. They do it's a cafe we used it. We used
We've got to make something easy. I want to get some food. I was wondering maybe.
Yeah, that's so nice. Yeah, because it's the one. It's like intense thing, like the educational system to like absolutely nothing. It's just like,
I just say that.
So well, you only want to do yeah. I mean, that's she's stressed. Why is she stressed? But there was she did seem quite stressed. She was here, she was stressed. I didn't watch on it. I did. Stress.
yeah. Yeah, like
I could like
I
sense
feel like
the stress
I went back to. I'm from
So I just did a little like
I got all the messages through.
my bike, and then like now that London's like opened up, it's like I can cycle here in 20 minutes. I don't know. I feel really stupid that I haven't had a bike here before. Like I think it's super next to what I did. But I spent so much money on public transport to get everyone.
I can get that in a drift. I was like,
Yeah, no, it is scary. I was like turning onto a road today, and I didn't quite see this motorbike, and then it just like zoomed past me, and I was just like,
I looked through my laptop, she was like, oh, I'm going to
yeah, and then I had to cycle from Marylebone to Harrogate, which took me like over an hour. But it's because I was like stopping at every street corner, like, shit, where do I go? So I was trying to
you always I really thought
unless you don't know it, that's the thing, you just like start from the beginning. But I really use like Google Maps for my earphones.
I know it's doing my essay.
Sat nav.
It's ridiculous.
But it's kind of like out of time. So like
It's such a dark day. So really kind of dramatic. And my sister at home. She was literally just like, smiling a lot, like, she's like floating ridiculous, like,
I'm excited for that.
University to finish essay. I'm like,
You should do.
it's just like not an issue. It was just like what's the grade of it? And it's like shit.
And people
But
like
it's bad. It's fun.
Yeah, I was always in London not feeling like pressure, but these last few months just being like,
Okay.
yeah.
Where is Alex? You're gonna. All right. I'll make a few remarks about the things I was going to ask Emma about, which is to do with really which is really about the experience of the 2017 election, because I think obviously the 2017 general election is a sort of historical event which is still open to sort of multiple explanations and interpretations, and sort of the explanation of which is quite contentious and important. And but I think my sort of my contention would be is that what happens at the 2017 general election is that there's a really, clearly something happened during the campaign which was really significant. I don't think it was as significant as a lot of the analyses that are offered by journalists or commentators, because I think one of the issues was that polling was just assuming that turnout would be very low amongst young people in a way that it wasn't. So I think that was part of the issue. But I also think one of the major factors was this mass mobilisation of the Labour Party membership and members and supporters. There was kind of mass persuasive canvassing going on in marginal constituencies in a way that hadn't really been. There really hadn't been for decades on some level, and a lot of that was being facilitated by the apps, the kind of famous by the apps like Find My Marginal, My Nearest Marginal. What was the one that let people talk to people they've been canvassing?
That's called Chatter.
Yeah, Chatter, which is hardly gets talked about at all. But Chatter actually enabled people to go canvassing and then build relationships with voters at the doorstep. And this kind of mass and this kind of this digitally enabled mobilisation. I think partly happened by accident. It partly happened because there was this stalemate at the time between the leadership and the bureaucracy, which of the party, which was still being controlled by the right, who wanted Corbyn to lose, basically. So that meant there was this kind of vacuum which was filled really by momentum, of supplying these apps and enabling members to more or less self-organise using those technologies. I think that's fair enough, don't you?
I think that would be my analysis. I kind of know the person who wrote My Nearest Marginal, so that piece of, just to talk about as a hack, that piece of software was put together in a weekend, from very sketchy, literally someone in Momentum just drawing on a thing saying, "Oh, it kind of work like this," and it basically changed potentially the course of the entire election.
And I think I think what's sort of to me, what's problematic is I don't think the Labour leadership now recognise that that's what happened. or that's why they won the election. I think they think they won the election because the manifesto was really popular, or because or because the broadcasting rule. The worst explanation that you hear this all the time. So it's because during the campaign the BBC has to be impartial. That's why we won the election. I keep saying, well, that was the same in the last 10 elections. Like we didn't get like a 10% increase in vote share. And I think there is. I mean, it's worrying to me because I think exactly the tendencies that Paolo has been talking about in kind of 21st century digital parties, the tendency to centralisation, to charismatic leadership, are kind of making it very difficult for people to realise that. I don't think the leadership do have their heads around this. I don't know exactly what it would look like if they did. I mean, I don't know. None of us know, and I think it's sort of clear in a way that none of us really know what the answer would be. Well, what would it really look like for a modern mass party that's contending in elections at a national scale? What would it look like to say, oh, well, actually, the reason we won that election is because people were basically doing kind of jugar, and at the street level, what would it look like? We don't know. I mean, I don't want Labour to suddenly turn into the Five Star Movement, and I don't want, or even Podemos probably. But I wouldn't mind actually. It's Podemos. but it's the fact the question isn't even being asked. That was not one of the terms of reference of the Democracy Review at all in the Labour Party. It's not one of the terms of reference. Like, how do we do anything? Because basically, the people now controlling the leader's office see that as a problem. They look at the kind of messiness of, indeed, I'm going to keep you saying jugar because I think it is an accurate description. Actually, they look at that kind of messiness and that kind of improvisatory quality of what was actually going on the ground, doing it by accident, really, during the 2017 election. They think, well, that's a problem. It was a problem. It was only happening because we didn't have full control of the party machinery, and they don't really want that to happen again. And I think that's a terrible mistake. I think they're going to really regret it if they don't find a way of kind of realising that kind of that sort of democratic potential, which is there in those sort of situations. All right, that's the spiel anyway. About that's the Labour Party spiel. I think we'll open it to questions now and comments from from the floor, because I think I've said quite a lot up here. So questions, comments.
Are we talking about questions about?
Yeah, for anybody.
Yeah. So we were just talking. You on the end. Sorry, was your name Alex? Sorry, we were talking about the homogenisation of the web, and you did touch upon it about the sort of introduction of things like React and Gatsby and all these new softwares that are really enabling people to scale their projects, etc. But is it a concern that they're so useful and going to be so integrated that it's disempowering people, especially like in different HTML cultures? You've got like low bandwidth, etc. It's really separating the web. It's kind of creating this Facebook, Google generated world. What's your space in that, especially like as far as politics as well?
Okay, so we're talking about the kind of homogenising effects.
Yeah, it's just really worrying. I've just started coding, and I've come from a background of human rights, and like when you talk about diversity in tech, when you come from something there, then start coding and you realise how fucked it all is. You've got to do it in React, and it's like that's the new thing. No one wants HTML and CSS and blah blah blah. They want it all in these latest scripts, and it becomes legacy eventually. But it's worrying that the people that are designing this is like Facebook and Google.
All right, so I'm going to ask Alex briefly to respond to that, and then I'm going to ask Amit to come out.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so just to be really briefly, like React is a open source library that's produced by Facebook for producing kind of like web interfaces. So it's used on Netflix. So if you've ever used Netflix, you've been passively using React, despite the fact it's a technology produced by Facebook. It also obviously powers Facebook itself, or some elements of it, and a whole load of websites. The BBC, like basically any major like player apart from Google, kind of uses it. And I think in response to your question, I kind of agree. Definitively, what's happened to kind of open source cultures is large corporations have fully embraced them now. Because what they're trying to do is they're trying to get younger developers to understand their technologies, understand their kind of like platforms like React, even their languages. So, for example, the most current crop of like programming languages are kind of produced in-house by corporations. For example, Go, which is produced by Google, Swift, Apple, blah 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 blah. So yeah, I do think in comparison to the previous thing, which was kind of open standards, they were available to anyone, and they were owned by kind of like charities or kind of like non-profit bodies, or kind of like benevolent dictators for life, versus the current paradigm, which is kind of like these technologies are open source, but they're kind of the conditions of possibility of their reproduction, like their continued development, are dependent on private corporations. I think that's a big change, and I could talk about that at huge length. In fact, I'm working on a paper with French computer scientists specifically on this change. So yeah, I think definitively it is a rather sinister term. I think React is a brilliant piece of software, but I wonder like on what cost. For example, if Common Knowledge produces an app, it will almost certainly be written in React. They do have what's called permissive licenses, so it's not like anyone can like turn these things off because they're fully open source. But it is a rather sinister turn, or something that should be at least thought about politically. That Microsoft, who used to be the major enemy of open source software, are now producing it by reams and reams and reams of open source software. The most common editor that people use now for like coding is produced by Microsoft, and it's free at the point of use, but it kind of gets you in there. GitHub, which is owned by Microsoft, blah blah blah. So yeah, I do think it's a relevant political concern, but I won't waffle on because I could go on for quite some time.
Wasn't that model of the proprietary open source system? I mean, that was the OS 10 model as well, isn't it? That was the Apple OS 10. I think it was. When OS X or OS 10, whichever you want to call it, was.
Oh yeah. So yeah, I mean OS 10, which is the kind of like current iteration of Mac software, was kind of like a fork of the previously software called. Was a fork of FreeBSD, which is another free software platform. So essentially, pretty much all the big cloud digital providers have done is outsource all their development, like a large percentage of their development, to the commons, essentially open source software. So Amazon's primary business model is reselling open source software back to you. So basically taking it in-house, improving it to bring it to scale, and then flogging it back to you. And I think that one thing that should be talked about is the possibility of like using legal hacks or other hacks to kind of like disempower this. So for example, there are now open source licenses emerging that kind of prevent this behaviour by stopping people reselling it essentially.
All right, so Amit, so what? I mean, how do the people you're sort of studying in the book? How are they relating to these shifts in kind of the software culture, its class relations?
I was thinking about the question of homogenization in relationship to sort of forms of becoming normal. How do you normally or become a normal person relating to a mobile phone, for instance, right? What does that mean? What does it mean in the like economy? In India, WhatsApp has had a very ambivalent history. I don't know if people have been sort of following what the effects of WhatsApp has been in India, but there have been lynchings organized through WhatsApp. So anyone who's not from the neighborhood, it goes on WhatsApp and that person's picked up by a mob. And that's happened around 20-25 times just this past year. So the technology, I think, is really ambivalent in that sense. I think in terms of who's in the industry in India, it's by and large upper caste men who are the coders in India, certainly. I'm also thinking about sort of how diversity is managed in these industries, and it seems to me that there's I like this term artificial negativity, this idea that to be against is actually produced within these forms of power, that they're already kind of included, sort of captured in some profound ways, and I think this is something that one sees right now. I mean, there's an election going on right now in India, and a lot of what is happening is this kind of a sense of, we're speaking out, but in fact it's being included in a variety of ways by the sort of right-wing press and the technologies that they're using as well. So.
All right, thanks. I think we'll take another question or comment.
one of the things I found quite interesting is that it seems like both digitally or the digital sphere and in the physical sphere, there's still, like digitally in groups like WhatsApp, you just recreate what people who've been going along to late party meetings have been experiencing for years, which is as soon as the group gets bigger than a specific size, you start losing people. It's the same people who speak up within a group. You spend a lot of time sitting in on something, whether that's a WhatsApp group or a meeting, trying to find out what's going on and who are the people worth listening to. I was just wondering whether the panel has any thoughts on that and how the digital world might be able to help with that, either in the digital sphere or in the physical sphere.
Paolo, do you want to come on?
Could the man with the microphone repeat what the lady without a microphone said?
Okay, well, we sometimes we have people take the mic. Do you want to come up and do it yourself with the mic? Then? I think it's better that way.
Hi. I was just saying that the same problems seem to be encountered both in physical meetings and in things like WhatsApp groups, where a specific small group of people kind of tend to dominate the conversation, to really be able to figure out what's going on. You spend a lot of time kind of either reading other people's kind of comments in the group or listening to people speaking in the meeting. And so we're just recreating the same dynamics, but in a digital context. And I was just wondering whether the panel had any ideas on how to solve that problem, both online and in physical meetings.
Okay, yeah. Paolo, do you want to... You go, Morris.
Musical chairs. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, it's a problem. Lecturers also have these seminars, right? Where you have the student who is a bit too eager to speak, or I mean, it's a problem, I think, of many groups, right? Besides political groups, and it raises questions for democracy in a sense that how representative are certain decisions of the people's actual desires, or are these decisions simply a reflection of the most active section of the constituency? Is a problem that, for example, Robert Michels already described when he talked about the habitué of meetings, people who like meetings. That's a psychopathology that hasn't yet been cracked. In Spain, they call these the democracy of asses of steel, because you need asses made of steel or other minerals or other metals in order to go through those meetings. And that's partly also a question of democracy, because besides finding meetings boring, which is normal, is also a question that some people cannot go to meetings because of disability, for example, or because of geographical remoteness, or because of family or work commitments. So that is really a barrier to democracy, the fact that these people cannot go to meetings. So first and foremost, I think the fact that now through apps or other tools, some people may participate in decisions, in voting at least. Yes, it's a very flat form of interaction, but still is a form of interaction, as an important democratic potential. It shouldn't be underestimated. Right? The fact that decisions are not just the monopoly of people who can actually make the time to go to meetings. Yeah? Then there is a question of filtering, namely how do you manage complex discussions in which there are hundreds, if not thousands, of users' contributions, and basically avoid fundamental information overload, right? And make sure that there is a kind of rational discussion going on. At that level, there are already some promising developments, especially kind of in the case of Consul, the software Alex was talking about. There is the kind of second instantiation of Podemos's deliberation platform, where they have a very sophisticated understanding of basically thresholds, right? They have a number of thresholds whereby if I'm putting forward a proposal, for example, eliminating chlor from swimming pools, this is an actual proposal made in Barcelona by some people who are really kind of concerned about this issue. Probably is not a majoritarian one, also given the possible consequences on hygiene and bacteria. I can make that proposal, but if that proposal is not supported by whatever, 2.5%, 3%, according to threshold, to the required threshold, then that is just forgotten, right? Then if it is supported, then that moves on to another room, right? And so on and so forth. So now we have some techniques, basically metrics, ultimately, right? Interaction metrics that operate by following the law one like, one vote, that can be used to do, basically to develop what sometimes has been described as deliberative polling methodologies, where you have both an element of kind of qualitative element of saying, I would like to have these, and a quantitative element of weighting and filtering based on the weight, based on the up vote, down vote, that can allow for both a focused and an in-depth discussion.
Okay, that's really useful. Thanks. All right, I'm going to take any more. Any questions? So, yeah. So there's one here, and then there's Archer. There's a bunch now. Okay. So, do you want to come up?
Yeah. So maybe Paolo. If you studied digital parties, did you study DiEM25? And I was wondering, because it's a pan-European movement, who also you become a member online, and you can you're part of the voting system online. I was wondering what you think about it, if you think it's also a centralized leadership, because there are central leaders within it, or figures at least within it, or speakers. But still, there's a lot of people involved, because it's in every country within Europe at least. So if you just could tell about it.
Perhaps I could just stand there so that you don't have to move around. Yes, I mean, I think it is definitely an example of digital party, in a sense that it applies similar methodologies. I think they have around 10,000 people online. They actually voted on various things, such as participation of the Italian chapter of
That's gone.
It's your fault.
Yeah, there we go. You have to just switch it on.
Only it's a standard debugging.
Sorry. Okay, so I'd say on the first point, yes, it is an example of digital party. They have a platform, they have consulting members on a number of things. Secondly, is it a leader-centered party? Yes, very much. I mean, honestly, who would know about DiEM without Yanis Varoufakis, his charismatic, histrionic persona, his motorcycle and good looks? Right, let's be honest. And I think, personally, I don't find anything necessarily wrong in that, as I don't find anything wrong in people's obsession with AOC personality. I think always politics has been partly, mass politics at least, has involved an element of personality, leadership, and fascination, charisma. Obviously, it needs to be, so you need to guard against its possible exaggerations and risks, right? Someone coming from Italy, I'm aware of that, but that shouldn't lead us to basically think that charisma as such and personalization as such leads necessarily down the road to fascism, right? Because in fact the best response to kind of totalitarian politics is sometimes to really play with emotions and identification and visceral attachment to people in the opposite direction.
All right, thanks, Paolo. Yeah, they're trying to promote one other guy, aren't they? The younger face of TM20, some guy who's mates with Zizek and also mates with Varoufakis. That's supposed to be exciting. I think it shows that it's a long 90s phenomenon. If you're trying to tell people it's exciting because you've got a Slovenian philosopher. Sorry. Okay, so Archie, was it next?
Hi, I read Paolo's book recently. I'd strongly recommend it. But a lot of it is spent on sort of dissecting or critiquing the digital party, whereas all the sort of conclusions for what might be the alternative is largely sort of crammed into the last 2 pages, rather than necessarily sort of spelling out a manifesto for what we need to do next. I couldn't help but draw the conclusion from a lot of it that basically a lot of what you're describing is sort of technological attempts to solve quite deep social and political problems with quite superficial technological fixes, and that actually, if we want a sort of serious democratic political project, you can't get away from the mass party in one form or another, and that the forms of intermediary levels that were talked about earlier, whether in terms of party branches, party cadres, political education, party media, all the rest of it, that's actually the infrastructure that you need to have the sort of collective decision-making, collective political subjects that Jeremy was speaking about earlier. So I want to know would you agree, or would the other panellists agree with that analysis? And if so, or if otherwise, what is the way forward for building, applying? Because if we think these digital platform parties are not the answer, what is the answer, and how do we build that? Because I don't think Momentum is actually working on this seriously. I don't think anyone in the Labour Party is working on this seriously. So I think the rest of us are going to have to start finding some answers to this.
All right, should we just go along the panel and let people answer, let everybody say what is to be done? What do we do? It's 5 minutes early for that question in the evening, Archie. Seeing as you've asked it. All right, I'm just going to go along, starting with Alex. I called you Andrew because your surname.
People always used to do that at school. No, you never do it. Okay. That's not an easy question. Turns out I genuinely don't have an off the top of the dome answer, but I do know that the prescriptions of the 20th century, kind of return to either an incredibly strong and centralised Leninist party, or alternatively the return to kind of a mass socio-democratic party, or alternatively return even to a mass anarcho-syndicalist, ultra-leftist kind of formation, is not there's no off-the-shelf solution, as we say in software engineering, for this problem. I think that what is necessary is to find a politics that is adequate for organising in post-Fordism. And I think that we've got the kind of materials. Earlier on we talked about potentialities. We've got the kind of stuffs out there, and movements are beginning to self-analyse themselves and understand their own dynamics. And I think that kind of learning the lessons of this most recent cycle of electoral struggles, in the same way that something like Extinction Rebellion tried to learn the lessons of the previous cycle of extra parliamentary struggles, in the sense that we can't just have consensus decision making with 300 people in a square near the stock exchange. We need to actually have a persistent organisation in time. That was basically one of Extinction Rebellion have many problems, but one of their innovations is realising you have to have a continuous kind of organisational form that that operates beyond particular moments of protest. So yeah, I mean, the materials are out there, but it's all about the analysis of like the last couple of cycles of struggle, drawing from them the kind of like quote unquote lessons learned, what worked and what did not, and then attempting that next kind of like phase of this. And as I said, it's not going to be any of the existing off-the-shelf forms. I feel that quite strongly.
Should I stand there?
Wherever's comfortable.
Okay. Right. What is to be done? I think for me, as a person who was born in India, grew up in America, and has been in the UK for the past 10 years, I think forms of transnational solidarity is something still to be done. An important sort of aspect of organizing. I think there are new forms of agency emerging, and I think it's very important to recognize those forms of agency, and they have partly to do with new technological sort of infrastructures, but they also have to do with a certain kind of I think threshold that people have with the traditional party and forms of authority that have gone with it. I think you see that all over the world in different ways and with its own historical specificities. But I do think these forms of agencies, these new forms of agency, have to be recognized for what they are. They're a real challenge to what we have lived and seen historically. I also think we should develop our capacities to understand, work with, develop ethical know-how around what is post-capitalism. In India, there are aspects, and I believe that Jugaad practice is part of this, that it's post-capitalist. It's already sort of gone beyond what we accept and understand by that term. So that to me is a very important aspect of these new forms of agency.
Great, thanks.
Okay. These musical chairs is good because you stand up, your circulation comes back. Yes, I mean, I think in a way, in the last 2-3 pages of the book, I discussed that. I mean, in fact, yes. I mean, I didn't develop that much in the book, but I'd say is what we need is a synergy, is a mix of some of the new teachings of these digital parties and some old elements of the mass party. Namely, party branches, the way they were created was down to fundamentally to a technological impossibility of making decisions nationally, because you couldn't gather people nationally. It is one of the 3 basically technical challenges of their democracy, one being the problem of gathering, the other being the problem of information, the third being the problem of organization. I think the problem of information is still there. The problem of organization is still there. The problem of location probably is been fixed. I mean, I don't believe in technological fixes as such, but I'd say that is the one that has come closest to being fixed, in a sense. Now you can, in terms of kind of psychological interaction, psychological experience, gather people in a virtual place, as it were, right? So it means that you can make, once upon a time, to make a leadership election, you had to go through the branch, because the branch had to collect the ballots, and the ballots result had to be relayed. It was a relay point. It was fundamentally a relay point, right? Because you couldn't hold a national ballot gathering everything in the same place, because people were dispersed spatially. Ultimately, it's a question of geography. And that also had consequences for the database of members, because the database of members was maintained locally, was maintained by branches, and that had important consequences for the power structure. Because if the list of members is maintained locally, it means that the local leaders have quite some leverage vis-a-vis the national leadership. Now that you have a national database, right, it means that to a great extent these local cadres are disempowered. So on the one hand, what I think is a positive takeaway of some of these digital parties is the idea of let's reframe the role of local groups. Instead of all or most decision making, national decision making, because the local decision making still is the local groups that need to do that on candidates, policies and stuff. But national decision making, let's just do it online. It's more convenient, it's more democratic ultimately, because it includes more people. Let's instead use local groups for action and for integration. That is the fundamental task of mass parties ultimately. There was of mass parties, as Ostrogorsky put it, mass parties are the home of people in an atomized society where they find a sense of community. Let's turn CLP meetings into, let's bring your own cake and share it and have fun. Meetings are going to be boring forever, but let's bring an element of fun. And you'll see many of the new wave of activists joining those meetings. And let's turn them into places into platforms for action, right? Rather than places where people, right, talk for 4 hours about what to do, right? So that would be basically my recipe. You need some intermediate structure. You need to form new cadres. Sorry to use the John McDonald version, the pronunciation, instead of cadres. Because you need people who are able to organize people locally. But you shouldn't organize people locally in order to make them decide. Indeed, I think it's a positive element of Extinction Rebellion that has gone beyond the obsession with decision making as such and the procedure. Instead, the focus should be more on action and how we can fight against atomization and uprootedness in local communities where people don't go to churches or mosques or synagogues, and people need that sense of rootedness in a local area in their community. Because I think that's really the antidote against the right-wing populism that very much preys on the feeling of loneliness and uprootedness.
All right, thanks. I think in direct response to Archie's question, I would say, look, the mass party carries out a whole set of functions, and I think the functions are required, but they don't necessarily have to be carried out by a homogenous organisation. You need an ecology of organisations and institutions and practices which can enable those to be to happen. I think one of the challenges for Labour right now is I think under the conditions we've all been describing, actually, the conditions of platform capitalism, all those functions need to be carried out. Some can be carried out indeed by a mass political party in a way that during the epoch of sort of post-Fordism they really couldn't, and some now can again, so much to a lot of people's surprise, but many can't. And I think they need to get their heads around the fact that the 21st century party will have to be part of an ecology of institutions and organisations which the ecology altogether will see all those functions carried out. I would also say, I'd add to what Paolo was saying, that I think it's one of the things I think is now technologically possible and historically wasn't, and is really necessary in the 21st century, is that people who feel that they have common sets of interests that are not defined purely by locality are now able to organise themselves and coordinate themselves. I mean, this is something that Podemos has experimented with a bit, I know, but I think that is very important. I don't think we're going to change the fact that lots of people now feel that they belong to communities, they belong to collectivities, but they're not defined by locality, they're not defined by neighbourhood. And I think enabling people to mobilise themselves and organise themselves along those lines in some ways is a real potential of the new technologies, but it's not really one that's it's not yet. It's certainly not one that parties really have much sense of how to organise. I mean, there are models historically, actually. This has been completely forgotten history now, but when the Communist Party, after 1989, the official Communist parties of Britain, in both Germany and in Britain, for example, the CPGB, went through this real, massive process of self-criticism, trying to kind of reinvent themselves. And one of the models they came up with, both the Germans, Communist Party and the CPGB in Britain both experimented with this idea indeed of allowing networks to define self-defined networks around particular issues to become constituent elements of the organisation in a way which I know that people in Podemos have talked about that. I don't know how far we got. And we should take some more.
Wait, should I come up?
Yeah, it's better.
Okay. Hello.
Sorry, I think you already touched on this a little bit, so it might be kind of redundant, but I was just wondering how you considered the issue that technology and knowledge of how to use technology isn't necessarily something that's distributed equally, like socioeconomically. And as well, if you kind of think about the way that technology can create these networks of international solidarity, like with Podemos extending solidarity to the Victoria Ciudadana Party in Puerto Rico right now, like how do you consider the reality that like not all countries distribute technologies in the same way? Like in the case of Puerto Rico after the hurricane, like most people don't have phones or something like that. Anyway, thank you.
Okay, well, maybe brief comments from everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I think that any kind of like technologically enabled politics does need to be attentive to the fact that distribution of technology is uneven, stratified by a variety of factors. Age is one, although actually a lot of older people do tend to use the internet very much. For example, my dad uses it a ridiculous amount. Oh, my God. Mainly commenting on Guardian articles. Yeah, if you want to know who's below the line, it's retired people, just mostly retired people. So, you know, that's something that definitely the kind of digitally enabled movements need to be attentive to. But on the flip side, we kind of need to be aware that, you know, in the research here is that like there are digital ecologies in incredibly poor communities in the global south as well. That sometimes I remember when Paul Mason like kind of brought his book out. It's all kicking off. Is that what it's called? Yeah.
Why it's kicking off everywhere.
Yeah, why it's kicking off everywhere. A common reaction to that was like, well, you know, that's okay for like teenagers in the global north, but what about everyone else? And the fact is that like, yes, there is an unevenness to technological distribution, and you know there are people who genuinely do not have access to these networks, but we shouldn't be kind of like do a kind of like reverse Orientalism or something weird where we claim that like, for example, in India that these technologies aren't used a heck of a lot in all aspects of daily life, for better or worse.
Okay, Amit.
I actually like it. It's good.
It's good. This is good.
You
Okay.
can stretch your legs.
This is all right.
You should stand up for a minute.
Should I? Okay. Oh, no, just get this down.
No, I'm good.
You okay? All right, excellent. So in India, the knowledge of technology is very much controlled by caste. So, for instance, untouchable castes and lower castes were precluded from having and having access to certain kinds of knowledges. So, for instance, street sweepers were never allowed to develop technologies that would make their job easier. Things like that. So that has been historically a very important part of sort of Brahmanical domination. That having been said, I exactly agree that there are practices, and I believe that Jugaar is a vector of that practice. It's a kind of vector through which people are sharing knowledges that help communities and collective sort of practices that allow people to share knowledge that does not assume that what has been how people have been excluded is what we have to accept. That's really important. I think it's been a huge part of the recent upsurge in India around Dalit empowerment. So the term Dalit in India, it means the oppressed, but it's a term that has generally been used for people who have been lower caste, thought of as lower caste, and so these technologies and organizing online, but also developing precisely a non-geographically specific kind of identity formation in India has been very, very important through these new technologies. That all having been said, also that I think the knowledge that we're talking about is not just about this kind of academic kind of knowledge. It's really about a lived practice around how a know-how, right? That to me is a really important way of thinking as well about this knowledge. Yeah.
Yes, very quickly, as Alex said, I mean, in the book I talk, quoting a developer of Francis Sumis about the tyranny of people with time, and that I think is a tyranny that should really be guarded against. And on social media we see it all the time, indeed. And it's not just retired people, it's also young people who don't have a job, or I mean, sometimes don't have a job because they are relying on their parents for far too long, or people who are basically doing it from work. They happen to have works that allow them basically to spend the entire day on Facebook and participate in Facebook groups of all sorts. Then, talking about technology, indeed, it is a new form of inequality. The digital divide, I mean, is a term that was very trendy some years ago. Now is a bit off the radar. But there are new forms of digital divide, because digital divide is not just about having access or not having access to technology as such. It's also about differential levels of competence, right, in the use of technology. It's about being able to use whatever, being able to browse vis-a-vis being able to code, being able to moderate a discussion, being able to curate your social media. So I think that is something where schooling, where education really needs to develop serious progress. I mean, I know that schools in Britain are already doing something, but I think that needs to be upped seriously, because it is becoming a very important skill. Ultimately, it's becoming a literacy, a form of literacy that is as important as more traditional forms of literacy, and then has consequences for people's ability to engage with politics also actively. So perhaps, I mean, these days, social media and all things related is as important as public speaking, right? And therefore it should be part of the curriculum.
Okay, good. All right, is there any last? All right, now I'm going to take that opportunity then to wrap it up. I think, Debbie, do you want to make any announcements? This is Debbie.
Sorry, Alex. Cheers, Jim. Some of you might already know me. My name is Debbie Shaw. I teach the classes which I kind of lead up to these seminars. So it's kind of, you know, crash course in cultural studies, which I do earlier in the academic year. It was last year now. And I'm also one of the organisers of Anti-University Now, which this series has now become a part of. And Anti-University Now runs a festival every year. This year it runs from June 15th to the 22nd. We've got about, at the last count, I think we had about 170 different workshops, largely in London, but also we're now spreading out across the rest of the country and abroad. And we haven't even tried. I mean, I was actually sort of helping to publicise some workshops in Boulder, Colorado, for some bizarre reason. So the Anti-University is beginning to spread. It's based on the original Anti-University of 1968. This is the digital version. It all gets organised online. There are 6 organisers, and we help to publicise it, to distribute the workshops around venues. Got very, very varied programmes, so watch out for it. It's antiuniversitynow.org. So you can go to the website and you can sign up for updates. And we'll be posting the programme there on May the 19th. We actually go live on May the 19th. So traditionally now with these seminars, what we've been doing is we've been making an announcement, obviously about Anti-University Now, but also asking if anybody else has announcements to make. So if you've got anything coming up, any events, any political events, now is the time to publicise it. It also goes onto the podcast. So would anybody like to come up and publicise an event? You lazy sods.
Do more events.
Do more events. Yeah, don't just leave it all to us. We're getting knackered, right?
Thanks, Debbie. Well, I've got one to publicise, which is next week here, same time, same place. We're going to have Sarah Bannett-Weiser and Sarah Farris talking about feminism, neoliberalism, and nationalism. So that'll be good. And I'd like to close thanks to Reader Road Market Bar, a fantastic host. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to our fantastic panel. Really great discussion this evening. Thanks.